Today's episode is brought to you by Lingoda. And welcome back to my, what the hell is wrong with this? And welcome back to my study area, study chamber, or like, this is the equivalent for a humanities student of like a mad scientist's lab. And so far I'm doing some crazy experiments, some pretty interesting experiments. So I thought this is gonna be like a captain's log of like how the experiment's going. What kind of chemical weapons am I engineering in my secret little lab? But long story short, right now, after my little European summer, after my little vacation, I am right back into the center, the epicenter of research and academic research. So in the future, I really want to integrate what I'm doing for university or what I'm doing in this cult called academia in conjunction with these little video blogs to show you guys a real look into what being this kind of person's like, what being in the academy is really like. Because there are a lot of these false expectations floating around, you know, this is what it means to study literature at a university, this is what it means to live the neo-romantic life, to read poetry all the time, but well, in fact, this is a real look into what you're actually going to be doing in the academy. So I want to document this process as honestly as I could, and hopefully you guys will gain some value out of it. And down the track, I really want to film a video called Why You Probably Shouldn't Do a Degree in Humanities, to expose all the sort of false advertising that the academy is advertising. But nevertheless, for this video, I just want to show you guys like a minute-to-minute, or in fact, the future videos on this channel are going to be these minute-to-minute real look into what is involved in academic research in the humanities. So you can take these videos as points of departure for you to decide, do I want a career in this line of work? Do I want to become an academic? Or would I rather do something completely different? It is up to you, but it is my obligation to tell you what it's like in this very insular bubble. So think of me as kind of like a field journalist of what's going on in academia nowadays, and what are some of the questions that are involved in academia? What's going on in there? So let's get started. But before we get to that, just a quick note from today's video sponsor, Lingoda. Speaking of heading back to school, and speaking of me starting my grad school research stuff, where I have to write a thesis and all that kind of good stuff, as a part of this entire research into the humanities, sometimes it is so useful to pick up another language. Sometimes I cannot tell you the number of times where I thought to myself, this translation in English makes no sense, yet this is the only translation that exists. How do I break through the language barrier to access deeper insights from these papers that are potentially written in a foreign language? And this is where Lingoda really helped me out because, well, as a part of my research, I'm dealing with a lot of original papers and books in the original French. And without Lingoda's help, I'm probably still gonna be scratching my head staring at translations that make no sense. In short, Lingoda is an online language learning school. No, it is not a language learning app like Duolingo, where it features qualified teachers and a vast community for you to engage with using this new target language that you have. So far in the platform, they feature German and English from A1 to C1 level, alongside business English, French, and Spanish all the way up to the B2 level. One of the key parts of language learning is immersion, and with Lingoda, you're really gonna get that immersion through these little group lessons or one-on-one lessons with qualified teachers. And alongside all these lessons, there are also PDFs that you can read, useful resources, and of course, exercises for you to really consolidate your target language. And if you're kind of like me, dealing with a chaotic schedule of like needing to write a thesis and needing to do coursework, and of course have to spare out time to socialize with people so I don't go insane, Lingoda features a very flexible learning schedule, so you can slot in your lessons throughout your day so you don't really have to worry about not having time to engage with your target language. So try it out and ye shall find. And now you can click the link in the description down below for a free trial featuring 7 days where you can access Lingoda for free, and you can either pick one one-on-one lesson or 3 group lessons as a part of your free trial. And if you do decide to pull the trigger to embark upon your language learning journey, Lingoda right now, as a part of their back to school discount, is offering you guys a 25% off on your first subscription for the first 2 months. Head over to the link in the description down below for your trial and for your discount. Thank you, Lingoda, for sponsoring today's video. And now we're going to get back to my self-imposed TBR as a part of my research. Now, just as a bit of a preface, a lot of these books that I'm about to present to you guys, unless you're in the field, unless you're like super nerdy, unless it's kind of like niche music taste, unless you're a very specific type of person, these books won't probably appear on the shelves of your local Barnes & Noble. So think of this video as kind of like a niche music taste recommendation video. So if you have these questions that are bubbling up in your head, or if you are also doing some research of this kind, hopefully I can offer you some directions. But a part of me just wants to talk about what I've been reading and to sort of like counteract the shame that I feel for not reading much fiction lately, because my mind space is completely jammed up with all of these academic journals and reference material. So without further ado, here's the first book, which I've kind of prefaced in my Paris video. I am going to be digging through the entirety of Jacques Derrida's of Grammatology, or this is the original French edition called De la Grammatologie, and this is a Spivak's translation of the same work. Words simply cannot summarize what this book is about, and it is sort of like one of these mindfuck books, and where you read one page or you read like 5 pages, and sometimes you have to reread the same sentence 50 times, yet you still won't be able to make any sense out of it. But for the sake of simplicity and argument, and for the sake of you not clicking off of this video because it's gonna bore you to death, Jacques Derrida's work is entirely an interrogation of language and how language works in writing and speech. And the basis of Grammatology is a very close reading of the works of structural linguists such as Claire Lévi-Strauss, Ferdinand de Saussure, and alongside a bunch of close readings of the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And what you have here is what Peter Salmon, which is a biographer, one of the biographers of Jacques Derrida, he called this book a gloriously bonkers book. And sometimes you wonder to yourself, how bonkers does a book have to be in order for me to read the English translation and feeling like, the English translation is missing a lot of juice, and then I have to go to Paris just to pick up a French edition so I can really mine all the great insights out of these books. But maybe there are no great insights. Well, and that's the danger of digging into post-structuralist thinkers. Sometimes, how can you tell if they're advancing something positive, or are they merely tricking you into thinking that they're saying something profound, or are they merely, all these questions started bubbling up. So it is a very tricky field, and if you are also reading into Jacques Derrida's work, well, proceed with caution. I signed myself up for this. Recently I had a meeting with my advisor, and when I said that I wanted to do something on Derrida, he didn't give me a red light, but gave me kind of like a crimson light. He said it's going to be excessively difficult, but if you're up for a challenge, do it. So my head's going to be completely deep in these 2 editions of Grammatology. So let's see how it goes, and let's see if it's gonna cause some permanent psychological damage. Next book in the same vein, Theory and Practice by Jacques Derrida. This one's in English. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a French edition. And because the field that I'm working in is literary criticism, we only need about 1 to 2 primary texts in the original language. As for secondary sources, we don't have to read them in the original language, so that's why I picked up this little book, which ended up costing me like this slim little volume right here. It is like 60 AUD, Australian dollars, so it is ridiculously expensive to procure academic material, so sometimes maybe you should just download them from the internet. So unlike of Grammatology, this is actually a collection of seminars that Jacques Derrida did at the École Normale Supérieure, and compared to of Grammatology, this book is a lot easier to summarize. Derrida in this series of seminars was concerned with deconstructing, or in a sense exploring, this binary opposition between theory and practice. And that leads us to questions like, how much theory do we need to live a good life? Or how much theory, politically speaking, do we need to advance a positive social change? Because if you have too much theory, you're simply going to end up in the ivory tower. And if you have too little theory, you're going to be guided by some ridiculous actions because you don't have that framework to situate yourself in that frame of action. And how I'm explaining it right now is such a drastic simplification. And in this work, you really plummeted the depth of like this binary opposite between theory and practice. And there's a lot of sort of application to politics, application to ontology, and application to even Ludwig Wittgenstein made an appearance in this book. I haven't finished this book yet. I'm halfway through it. So I will keep you guys posted, because so far it is one of those difficult books that you simply have to sit through. Of course, being me, I took extensive notes in the margins, and I feel like it's one of the greater ways for me to understand a book. And I'll make a future video on how I keep my notes and how I keep all of these notes and how I sync all the notes across different devices. So that's Theory and Practice. It's a very fascinating little book, but it's way too expensive. So I'm probably gonna keep this one around for a while. So, 30 years later, you're still gonna find this book on my shelf because it was so expensive to procure. Next one, you guessed it. Another book by Jacques Derrida, and this one is a little more idiosyncratic. It's called Glas. It's not called Glas because a lot of French words have a silent S ending. And after reading about 10 to 15 pages of this one, sometimes I wonder if Derrida just wrote for the sake of just torturing students, because sometimes the act of writing is actually a lot more enjoyable than the act of reading. I don't know who said this, but easy reading is really hard writing. But Derrida sort of flipped the script around and said, hey, look, easy writing is hard reading. And I'm sure Derrida put a lot of work into his writing projects, but sometimes I wonder to myself, why would he write an entire book in 2 columns, assuming that I'm going to read this book twice, once reading the left-hand side column and the second time reading the right-hand side column. And the subject that he's tackling in this book is just like, I would even say it's more bonkers than of grammatology. In essence, this is a close reading of 2 authors. One is Hegel, which is one of these notoriously difficult philosophers to read. And on the right-hand side, there's a detailed close reading of the works of Jean Genet. I've read some secondary sources around this book, but so far it is very much, uncharted territory for me. But the only thing that I noticed when I started reading this book is just how difficult it is to navigate through the form of this book. And I ask myself this question all the time, can I be bothered reading this book twice? Or do the 2 columns actually speak to each other? And what's going on here? But another part of me is like, this book is really pretty to look at on the shelf. And this book is not cheap. And, all these academic materials, sometimes I think maybe they're running some sort of like a cultish practice. Why would they price these books in such a different price bracket compared to normal paperbacks? So anyway, if you've read this monstrosity of a book, leave me a comment. I'd like some help for me to get through this monster of a 2-columned book. So right now, let's take a break from the Jacques Derrida canon, and let's talk about a work of fiction that I'm trying to read as a part of this thesis. This is A Thief's Journal by Jean Genet, and so far it is a novel without breaks, without chapter breaks. It is basically kind of like a stream of consciousness into the criminal life of Jean Genet when he was a little younger. He was born to a young mother who eventually abandoned him to the government, and he grew up in all of these, crazy situations where he eventually decided to become a criminal. And after his stretch of criminal life, he decided to become a writer and to encapsulate his experiences into all of these novels when he was locked up in jail. This is actually one of his later works, which is a very honest look at his life, and it's unabashedly autobiographical. But with an author like Jean Genet, you really have to pay attention to the book stylistically, because the story isn't necessarily going to make sense. And the story sometimes, it goes off into so many different directions, and sometimes there are digressions. There's no one linear thread through the story to encapsulate his criminal life. Just like in real life, there's no one unifying narrative for us to describe our upbringings. And the only way Genet was able to capture his experiences through these weird digressions, through these beautiful poetic ways of phrasing his criminal life, and through these very witty dialogue. If you're into some post-war transgressive fiction, be sure to pick this one up, because it is a very good read, a very confronting read if you're not used to reading this kind of stuff. But nevertheless, I will finish this very soon, so I can start thinking about how it relates to my overall thesis. Next one, you've probably heard of this one, Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard. This is perhaps one of the most confusing philosophy books I've ever read. And this is by far the best translation I could find. The other translations by Penguin, they were just simply horrible. And I think sometimes for philosophical texts, avoid the black spine Penguin texts. Their translations are usually inaccurate, or in the worst case scenario, unintelligible. But the reason why I'm reading Fear and Trembling is because the way Kierkegaard critiqued literature, and a major part of my thesis has to do with ways of reading. Kierkegaard was a very interesting example because he didn't open up this book by providing a very neat introduction. He wasn't like any other boys or any other philosophy boys, but he started this book with 4 rewrites of Abraham's story of sacrificing his son. And that raises the question, is the act of rewriting an act of reinterpretation, or is the act of rewriting just about creating something entirely new? And then after these 4 rewrites, Kierkegaard descended into his theological and philosophical rambles for the rest of the book. And so far, it is still confusing as hell, even though it's deemed to be the best translation around the market. But just like many of the other books in this pile, I'm going to try my best to make some sense out of this. But I'm probably not going to learn Danish just to read the original, because I'm a human being. I'm a limited being. I have limited time on planet Earth, and learning Danish just to read Kierkegaard just doesn't seem like a fair use of my time. And last but not least, I've reserved the most boring book for the very end of this video. So those of you guys who are not here just for the boring stuff, you're probably already off of this video. But I'm currently reading this volume of academic essays on the notion of post-critique, and the book's name is Critique and Post-Critique. And this is kind of going to be like a major part of my thesis, because I'm looking at how literary criticism evolved and how it kind of ran out of steam recently, and how do we revitalize ways of reading, or how do we build on what we've had and to facilitate a new way of reading that encourages people to find something positive from their reading experience. Because a large part of literary criticism has something to do with exposing the social structure, or unearthing some sort of ideology, or like a subtle disdain for the populace. And this is what creates the ivory tower effect in the academy, where academics don't want to talk to normal people because they think normal people are kind of dumb and stupid. But as a consequence, the academy suffers from a lack of relevance because they don't want to talk to other people. And by extension, other people don't want to talk to academics because they're just so insular. They're just in their little bubble. So in my sense, my thesis is trying to ask, why can't we find new ways of reading that includes everyone, that includes the populace, that includes this messy thing called life? And why do we have this urge to reduce literature down to these stable frames of interpretation? Why do we feel the need to supply students with a bunch of stable interpretations? Why do we feel this need to always need to claim to be the authority or the key critic on a text? But that's going to trickle into another video blog that I'm going to shoot very soon, which is me trying to explain what my thesis is. So if you're into that, stay tuned, because this YouTube channel right here is about to turn into a documentary of my mad scientist lab progress. So that's all I have for today's episode, where I talked about a bunch of stuff that I've been reading recently, where I walked you through my self-imposed TBR of esoteric books. I hope that you've enjoyed this video thoroughly, and I will see you again for another captain's log, or an academic's log, or a mad scientist's log. Take care and goodbye, and don't lose your mind in pages of books, and I will see you in the next video.